So now we've been looking a little bit at the question of whether you can change the WACC or how finance choices affect the value of the firm. And so we've defined how you can do that by the choice of security. But we've also looked in some detail at the issue of what's called the Modigliani-Miller propositions, or proposition 1. And effectively, Modigliani-Miller is a sort of slightly depressing proposition from our point of view, because it says that you can't change the value of the firm by financing choices. But what's key for us is that it shows us what conditions you need for that proposition to hold. And we're going to fiddle with those propositions in the next few topics. But at the moment, we need to see what the conditions are that where it definitely has to hold. So we're going to calculate how the cost of equity is affected by leverage. So that's, in a sense, the key to this, is how the cost of equity adjusts when you try and use cheap debt. And you're going to see how the WACC effectively gets held constant, because as you pile up debt, the cost of equity goes up. You're going to see how the relationship between leverage and the beta works. So that's going to show you how the leverage increases the beta, and that's why your cost of equities changes. And you're going to be able to see what measures of debt you actually can use in practice, and how that influences your cost of capital, well, particularly your cost of equity. And then we're going to see, you've seen a couple of issues like dilution, and also how capital markets, perfect capital markets work. So that's what you've seen so far. So now again, we're going to come in and focus on a couple of those points and see whether we can give more detail behind them. So Modigliani-Miller is a Nobel Prize winning proposition, and at first sight it seems sort of almost blatantly obvious. It says that in perfect markets, you can't change the value of the firm by changing the financing choice. So the equity and debt choices cannot change the value of the firm. Now, as I say, in some sense that seems obvious. You think, my firm, what makes it valuable is the products it produces, the profits it generates, etc., etc. So how could it be that what I do in terms of how I finance that firm influences the value of the firm? But the Modigliani-Miller proposition is a little bit more subtle than it first appears, because in order for this to be true, we're going to need the cost of equity to be affected by leverage. So let me explain. What happens is, if you look at, following the topics we've just done, calculate your firm's cost of equity, calculate your firm's cost of debt, you will, if you've done it correctly, find that the cost of debt is cheaper than the cost of equity. So you can borrow money more cheaply than you can get it through shareholders by issuing more equity. And that makes sense, because the shareholders, remember, have that slightly loose claim on the firm. They only get paid if you make profits. If you don't make profits, they don't pay you. Whilst the creditors have a fixed claim on the firm, you pay interest or else. So generally speaking, because the claim is weaker, equity holders demand a higher rate of return. So you're sitting there in your office as, let's say, the finance director of the firm, and you say to yourself, well, this is interesting. My cost of debt is, let's say, 5%. My cost of equity is 10%. Surely, if I get more debt, I can reduce my cost of capital, I can get cheaper finance through debt, and therefore I can increase the value of the firm, because the lower WACC will cause lower cost of capital, increases the value of those future profits when you discount them back to today. So it feels straight at first sight that you can influence the value of the firm just by going for cheap debt. However, the key to the Modigliani-Miller proposition is the idea that the cost of equity is not independent of your leverage, of how much debt you have. So think of it this way. You start with what's called an unleveraged firm, a firm that's only equity financed. If something happens that makes your firm more valuable, let's say you have a good year, your firm is 10% more valuable, in principle, the value of your equity goes up 10%. And so your shareholders have a claim whose volatility is pretty much the same as the volatility of the firm's underlying assets. Okay, now let's take that same example, but let's think about a situation where actually the firm is half debt, half equity financed. So you have 50% of your value of your firm effectively is owned by some creditors, and those creditors are going to get paid come what may. So let's say the value of your firm goes up by 10%, as we said before. The amount of money you owe your creditors is unchanged. So you still owe them the same amount of money. So what happens to the extra 10% of value? It's loaded onto the equity. So a 10% increase in the value of the firm when it's got 50% leverage effectively increases the value of equity by 20%. So for every 10% increase of value, your equity goes up by 20% because all of the volatility is loaded onto equity. Now, of course, when the value of the firm goes up, that's very nice. The equity holders see the value of the firm go up by 10%. Their shareholder value goes up by 20%. They're very happy. But of course, the problem comes when the value of the firm goes down. So let's say your value of your firm goes down by 10%. You still got to pay the creditors, so they get paid whatever happens. What's left, it belongs to the shareholders. So again, in our 50% leverage example, the value of the equity has gone down by 20% for a 10% fall in the value of the firm. So effectively, what leverage has done is increased the value of the volatility of your equity, has made your shares more volatile because none of the risk is being held by the creditors, it's all put onto equity. And so what you get is the formula shown in the slide is that your return of equity is related to your leverage. So the slide is showing you the return on equity, RE, is equal to the return on equity for the unleveraged firm, so the all equity firm, plus the debt equity ratio times the difference between the unleveraged equity return and the cost of debt. So that sort of says that every time I go for cheap debt, so RD is almost always lower than RU, it doesn't help me because what it means is the cost of equity goes up. So every time I borrow money, the cost of my equity goes up by an offsetting amount, leaving the value of the firm unchanged. So Modigliani Miller has a slightly subtle story that says, even though debt looks cheap, every time I borrow money, it just raises my cost of equity, and therefore actually the overall cost of financing the firm remains the same. And so the more debt I have, the higher the cost of equity. So this is shown in figure 14.1, where you see that the overall cost of financing the firm is constant, is that yellow line, because even though debt is cheap, the blue line is always below the red line, the cost of equity keeps rising every time you try and borrow more money. So the red line goes up. And as I say, when you get close to bankruptcy, even the blue line starts going up, although that's sort of a little bit of a extra detail that we don't need to be too concerned with. The key point is it doesn't matter what you do to your share of debt or equity. In a Modigliani Miller world, it actually stays the same. So you can't really change the value of the firm by changing the equity debt mix. And so you get implicit in that is the idea that your beta is not independent of leverage. So this is shown in the slide here. The beta of the unleveraged firm is equal to the beta of equity times the share of equity in your firm times the beta of debt times the share of debt in your firm. So what you'll find is, again, it's the same idea. The reason why your cost of equity is going up is because the more debt you have, the higher your beta goes, so the more volatile your shares get. And therefore, the less shareholders want to hold it, the more you have to pay them to hold it. So overall, Modigliani Miller just simply says, cheap debt is not as attractive as it looks because you just load the risk onto the remaining shareholders, and the shareholders will penalise you for doing that, leaving you overall with the same cost of capital you started with. So leaving life in a situation where the capital structure doesn't matter for the value of the firm. What we're going to move on to next is to start looking at some nuances that show you why actually there are some capital structure effects. But what we needed to do first was to see what happens in the simple Modigliani Miller world so we know where we start from.